Montauk Point Light stands at the eastern end of Long Island, at 2000 Montauk Highway, where the land narrows toward the Atlantic and the sea routes approaching New York pass close to shore. Its story begins with a decision made far from this bluff. On April 12, 1792, the Second Congress authorized a lighthouse at Montauk Point under President George Washington. The decision belonged to a young federal government trying to make New York Harbor safer for ships and more useful for commerce. The tower would come later. First came the need for a fixed point that mariners could recognize from the water. The lighthouse was planned as infrastructure for a growing port, and its position at the eastern edge of Long Island gave it a very practical purpose: mark the land before the coastline disappeared into darkness. Construction began on June 7, 1796. The work was completed on November 5 of that same year. Sandstone blocks formed the tower, and its foundation was sunk deeply into the ground. At the time, the structure was much shorter than the tower visible today. Its first light appeared in 1797, when the station began serving ships navigating the waters around Long Island and approaching New York Harbor. The original light used whale oil lamps. That detail matters because the tower belonged to the maritime economy of its own time. The same ocean that carried ships toward New York also supplied the materials and fuel that made navigation possible. The lighthouse was therefore part of a larger system of movement, trade, labor, and risk. From the shore, it was a stone tower. From the water, it was a fixed reference point. But there was already a history beneath the tower's foundation. The eastern end of Long Island had been used by the Montaukett people long before a federal government placed a lighthouse there. Fishing, hunting, and other forms of subsistence had shaped the use of this coastline for generations. The Montaukett were not waiting for the tower to give the land a purpose. They already had one. What changed was the system through which that land could be described, transferred, and claimed. Among the names preserved in 17th-century records is Wyandanch, a sachem of the Montaukett people whose dealings with English settlers became part of the documentary history of Long Island. The paper trail is older than the lighthouse by more than a century. One document gives that transformation a precise date. On August 17, 1658, Wyandanch entered into a deed involving Henry Whitney of Huntington. A surviving copy of the document is held in the collections associated with the Brooklyn Center for History, and the archival description identifies Wyandanch as a sachem of the Montaukett. The deed records a land sale and connects the transaction to the English system of property records. The document is only one piece of a much larger history, but it is useful because it leaves something physical behind. Ink, names, conditions, and a claim recorded on paper. Long before the lighthouse became the landmark people recognize today, documents like this were changing how land could be understood within competing legal and economic systems. That is the first great change visible through the lighthouse. The land already had people, work, routes, and meaning. Then another system began putting ownership into written instruments that could be carried, copied, filed, and later used to support new claims. A century later, the federal government would place a navigational structure on the same eastern point. The two developments were separated by generations, but they belonged to a broader transformation. The coastline was becoming increasingly legible to institutions that measured it through property, commerce, navigation, and jurisdiction. The lighthouse did not create that process. It became one of its most durable physical markers. You can still stand beside the tower and look across the same horizon, even though the systems governing the land around it have changed repeatedly. By the end of the 18th century, the coast was being drawn into the maritime economy of the new United States. New York Harbor was becoming one of the country's most important commercial gateways, and ships approaching from the Atlantic needed reliable landmarks along the eastern end of Long Island. Montauk Point occupied an awkward but valuable position. It was far from the harbor itself, yet precisely because of that distance, it could serve as a warning and reference point for vessels approaching the island. The lighthouse gave captains something fixed against the moving coastline. Its light separated land from darkness and helped turn a dangerous approach into a navigable route. The tower's purpose was simple. Its consequences would extend far beyond the light itself. And in 1796, the structure finally appeared on Turtle Hill. The building that rose there was not yet an old monument. It was new infrastructure, built for working ships and working people. Its first keepers would tend the lamps, maintain the station, and keep the signal functioning through the night. The tower would later be altered, enlarged, and surrounded by new structures, but its essential role began here. It was built to survive weather, darkness, and changing patterns of maritime traffic. No one constructing it could know how many economic systems would pass around it. The whaling era would come and go. Railroads would reach the eastern end of the island. Land would be bought, sold, divided, and valued in new ways. Through all of that, the tower would remain a fixed point against which the changes could be measured. That is why the lighthouse matters as more than an old building. Its biography begins before the stone was laid, with a coastline already used by the Montaukett, and with land transactions recorded in the 17th century. It enters the federal story in 1792, rises on Turtle Hill in 1796, and begins its work as a navigational aid in 1797. From there, its physical presence gives the larger history something unusually concrete to hold onto. The land around it can change hands. The economy can change. Roads and railways can redraw access. The meaning of distance can change. The tower itself remains the reference point. The lighthouse stayed. The Long Island around it changed. The story of this coast did not begin with the lighthouse. Long before the tower was built, the eastern end of Long Island was already occupied, used, and divided according to systems that existed before American federal authority reached this shore. One of the names preserved in the surviving records is Wyandanch, the sachem of the Montaukett people. He died around 1659, but documents connected to his lifetime remain evidence of how land relationships were already being recorded in writing. One of those documents is dated August 17, 1658. It records a land transaction involving Wyandanch and Henry Whitney, an English settler, and identifies Wyandanch as the sachem of the Montaukett. The document matters because it removes one convenient fiction from the beginning of the story. There was no empty coastline waiting for someone to give it an economic purpose. There were people here, and there were established ways of using the land and the water. Fishing, hunting, and other forms of resource use were part of that earlier economy. The eastern end of Long Island was connected to the sea because the sea provided food, materials, and routes of movement. Land had value because people used it. The shoreline had value because it supported that use. The written transaction of 1658 marks a different kind of system entering that landscape. Land relationships were increasingly being expressed through English forms of ownership, contracts, and recorded transfers. The exact meaning and consequences of every transaction cannot be reduced to a single modern phrase, but the surviving document establishes something concrete. Montaukett territory was already inhabited and economically used when European property systems began formalizing claims through written deeds. That distinction becomes important later. By the 18th century, the eastern part of Long Island was tied more closely to a network of maritime settlements. ships, ports, farms, fishing grounds, and coastal trade connected communities that were still far from the dense metropolitan landscape that Long Island would eventually become. One of the most important places in that network was Sag Harbor. In 1784, Sag Harbor became the first official port of entry in New York State. That status reflected something larger than a line on a government document. Ships were moving through the region, cargo was being handled, and the harbor was becoming part of a wider commercial system. The lighthouse at Montauk Point had been built for navigation at the far eastern edge of that system. Sag Harbor was one of the places where the economic consequences of maritime traffic could be seen more clearly. And one industry would make those consequences enormous. In 1778, whaling vessels were already operating from Sag Harbor. Over the following decades, whaling became one of the major sources of local wealth. Ships left the harbor for distant waters, sometimes remaining away for long periods while crews searched for whales and returned with oil and other products that could be sold through established markets. The scale of that economy can be measured in surviving historical research. A study of Suffolk County history gives the value of Sag Harbor's whale catch between 1785 and 1875 as $25 million in the money of that period. That is a historical figure, not a modern equivalent. It should not be converted casually into today's dollars. The useful fact is the scale recorded for the period itself. $25 million. A coastline that had long supported local subsistence, and trade had become part of a commercial industry capable of generating enormous returns over several generations. And the ships themselves made the scale visible. In 1847, Sag Harbor's whaling industry reached its peak. The port had 63 whaling vessels making long voyages. 63 ships. Each one represented crews, supplies, investment, cargo, and months or years spent beyond the coast. The harbor was no longer simply a local point of access to the sea. It was an operating center for an industry whose reach extended far beyond Long Island. The lighthouse at Montauk Point belonged to this maritime geography. Its function was practical. Its light helped vessels navigate the approaches around the eastern end of the island and toward the waters connected with New York Harbor and Long Island Sound. But the economy behind those ships depended on conditions that could change. Whaling required access to whales. It required vessels capable of long voyages. It required crews, equipment, fuel, food, and capital. And it required markets for the products brought home. By the middle of the 19th century, those conditions were becoming less favorable. The industry faced changing whale populations, expensive long-distance voyages, and competition from other sources of lighting and industrial materials. There was no single switch that turned the old economy off. The change came through the accumulation of pressures that made the previous model harder to sustain. For the communities connected to Sag Harbor, that mattered because the port economy was not an abstract number. It supported ships, trades, merchants, workers, and businesses whose existence depended on maritime traffic. And while that economy was reaching its limits, another mechanism was beginning to alter the meaning of distance: the railroad. A ship could connect Long Island to distant markets, but a railroad could change the relationship between the coast and the people living elsewhere on the island. It could move people and goods overland according to a timetable. That difference would eventually matter to the value of the land itself. The old economy had a coastline. The new one would have a timetable. The next change began with a transaction that looked almost ordinary on paper: land, an auction, a buyer, a price. But in Montauk, the scale of the transaction mattered. In 1879, Arthur Benson acquired 10,000 acres of Montauk at auction for $151,000. The local historical record treats that purchase as one of the decisive turns in the territory's history. 10,000 acres was no longer simply a stretch of coast with an existing economic use. It was a block of property large enough to be planned, divided, connected, and valued according to what might happen there later. The price was $151,000. And the important thing was not only what Benson bought. It was what the purchase allowed people to imagine the land could become. For generations, the coast had been tied to fishing, hunting, shipping, and the practical value of access to the water. Now ownership itself could become part of the economic mechanism. A map could begin to matter almost as much as the ground beneath it. A line on paper could describe a future road, a future railway, a future settlement, or a future price. That was the new language of Montauk. And the lighthouse, standing at the eastern edge, remained in the same physical place while the meaning of the surrounding land began to change. The transformation was not controlled by one man alone. It came through a larger system of railways, land ownership, financing, and transportation. Benson was one documented face of that system. The mechanism was bigger than him. In the same year, 1879, the remaining portion of the South Side Railroad was sold after foreclosure. A reorganized Brooklyn and Montauk railroads soon became part of the Long Island Railroad system. The sequence matters because the railway was being rebuilt at the same moment that large tracts of eastern Long Island were being treated as development property. The machinery was beginning to align. A railway could turn a remote tract into something reachable on a schedule. That simple fact had economic consequences. If people could arrive reliably, land that had once seemed distant could be considered for uses that depended on regular movement. Then came Sag Harbor. On July 17, 1881, railroad service reached Sag Harbor and connected the port with the larger network. Passengers and goods could now move through eastern Long Island by rail, reducing the importance of the old dependence on water routes for certain kinds of movement. The change was physical. Tracks were laid. Stations appeared. Timetables replaced portions of the uncertainty of coastal travel. And once a timetable existed, distance became something that could be measured in hours instead of miles. In January 1881, Austin Corbin gained control of the Long Island Railroad and began reorganizing the system. Corbin was born in New Hampshire in 1827, built his fortune through banking and railroads, and eventually became one of the principal figures behind the expansion of the Long Island Railroad. His interest in Montauk was unusually specific. He saw transportation and land as parts of the same project. His plans included a deep-water harbor at Fort Pond Bay, where transatlantic passengers could potentially continue their journey toward New York by train. The proposal connected the ocean, the harbor, the railway, and the land into one chain. The lighthouse had once existed because ships needed a fixed point at the edge of the island. Now the railway system was creating another kind of fixed point, a station, a route, a destination. And those two systems were beginning to overlap. By 1895, the land transactions had become larger again. The heirs of Benson sold 4,000 acres of Montauk to Austin Corbin and Charles Pratt for $200,000. The transaction gave the railway project an even more direct relationship with the land itself. Then, on December 17th of that same year, the railroad reached Montauk. That date closed a circle that had been forming for decades. A lighthouse had marked the eastern edge for ships. A railway now reached that same eastern territory from inland. The coast had acquired another connection to the outside world. And with that connection came a different way of calculating value. 4,000 acres could be discussed alongside a railway line. A harbor could be discussed alongside a station. Land could be valued according to access, and access could be engineered. The railroad did more than move people. It changed what distance was worth. By 1895, the railroad had finally reached Montauk. The track that had once seemed like an extension of the island's existing transportation system was now arriving at a place being discussed in much larger terms. Austin Corbin had spent years looking at Montauk through the combined logic of transportation and land. A railroad could carry passengers east. Fort Pond Bay could receive ships. Put the two together, and Montauk could potentially become part of a route between the Atlantic and New York. In 1896, Corbin pushed that idea further. His proposal connected Fort Pond Bay with the railroad, with the larger ambition of creating a transatlantic port at Montauk. The geography made the proposal understandable. Ships arriving from the Atlantic could potentially reach the eastern end of Long Island, and passengers could then continue by rail toward New York. The railroad was no longer simply following commerce that already existed. It was being used to imagine commerce that did not yet exist. That distinction is where the new value of the land became visible. Access itself had become part of the project. Montauk began acquiring the physical pieces needed for that vision. In 1896, a steel pier was constructed at Fort Pond Bay. It extended 400 feet into the water, giving ships and passengers a structure that reached out from the shore toward the deeper water. A hotel was also established at Montauk. Together, the pier and the hotel represented a different scale of investment. The coastline had long supported local work and maritime activity. But now buildings and transportation facilities were being arranged around the movement of people arriving from somewhere else. 400 feet of steel could look like a small number on a map. On the ground, it was a statement about how the shoreline was supposed to function. A pier gave passengers a place to land. A hotel gave them somewhere to stay. The railroad gave them a route onward. Each piece depended on the others. Remove one, and the system became less useful. Keep them together, and the eastern end of Long Island could be presented as a transportation destination rather than simply a remote coastal point. Then, only 2 years later, Montauk was asked to absorb a very different kind of movement. In 1898, Camp Wikoff was established on Montauk land for American veterans returning from the Spanish-American War. Contemporary accounts and later historical records describe a camp designed for a huge influx of troops. Roughly 30,000 veterans passed through the camp during its operation. The figure is large enough to change the physical meaning of the landscape. Roads, camps, medical facilities, supplies, transportation, and sanitation all had to function on a scale far beyond ordinary local needs. The land had become infrastructure again, but this time the traffic was military and temporary. The same eastern peninsula that had been considered for transatlantic passengers was being used to receive American soldiers. Montauk was connected to national events through the movement of people, equipment, and supplies. The railroad mattered because thousands of people could be brought into and out of the area. Distance was becoming something that could be managed through transportation. And through all of this, there was one older structure still standing at the edge of the continent. Montauk Point Light had been there since 1796. The railroad ran through the same broader landscape. The pier reached into the same ocean. The hotel belonged to the same new economy of movement. Camp Wikoff occupied the same peninsula. The Lighthouse did not direct these projects, and it did not determine their success. It simply remained a fixed physical point against which the scale of the changes could be seen. The lighthouse itself had already undergone a major transformation. In 1860, the station was substantially reconstructed. The tower received additional levels, its lantern was enlarged, and a new keeper's dwelling was built beside it. The changes were practical. Navigation technology was improving, ships were changing, and the station needed to remain useful. The old tower was therefore not frozen in its original form. It was repeatedly adapted to the demands of the maritime system around it. By 1897, the light was still operating. Its fundamental job had survived the arrival of the railroad. At night, the lantern continued to serve vessels approaching the coast, even as new tracks were carrying people across the land behind it. One system moved through darkness over water. The other moved across the island on steel rails. That is what makes the peak of this story slightly strange. The lighthouse had been built because ships needed a reliable point on the coast. By the end of the 19th century, Montauk's new future was increasingly being organized around the railroad. The coast still mattered, but access to the coast could now be engineered from inland. A pier could extend the shoreline. A railway could extend the reach of New York. A hotel could turn arrival into a stay. A military camp could turn open land into temporary national infrastructure. The lighthouse stood between all of these changes, still performing the function for which it had been built. But the grandest part of the new plan did not survive. Corbin's vision for Fort Pond Bay as a transatlantic port did not become the permanent alternative gateway to New York that the project had imagined. The railroad reached Montauk. The pier was built. The hotel appeared. Thousands of soldiers passed through Camp Wikoff. Yet the great international port remained a plan rather than a lasting transportation system. The irony is difficult to miss. The most ambitious promise depended on ships crossing the Atlantic. The infrastructure that actually endured was the railroad. The grand port failed. The railroad remained. By 1895, the railroad had finally reached Montauk. The steel line now extended into a landscape that had once been measured mainly by farms, shoreline, and the working geography of the East End. But the railroad's arrival did not complete Austin Corbin's larger vision for Fort Pond Bay. The plan was to connect rail transport directly with an ocean port capable of handling traffic entering New York. The maps could show the connection. The shoreline could provide the harbor. Yet a transportation system exists only when the pieces function together. In Montauk, the railroad arrived. The great port did not become the enduring center Corbin had envisioned. That difference matters because infrastructure can outlive the purpose that first justified it. A railway does not need to become an international gateway to shorten practical distance. Once tracks connect a remote district with a larger network, movement becomes easier to organize. Land becomes easier to reach, and property can be considered within a wider market. That is an analytical conclusion from what followed, not a claim about what every investor intended. The important change was physical. A line had been laid across the island. Stations, roads, docks, and parcels could now be evaluated in relation to that line. Access had acquired a measurable form. Austin Corbin would not live to see the full consequences of that change. In 1896, he died after an accident involving a carriage. He was 64 years old. Some of the projects associated with Montauk remained unfinished. His death belongs in the chronology, but it does not belong in a morality tale. The failed port was not a punishment delivered by history for having ambitious plans. Corbin had helped push transportation and land development toward Montauk, and the system continued after the man was gone. That is the colder irony. The person disappears. The infrastructure remains. Decisions made around a railway can keep affecting land long after the person who promoted the railway is no longer there to see the result. The principle was already visible elsewhere on the eastern end of Long Island. In Sag Harbor, A railroad branch had opened in 1870. That connection arrived while the old maritime economy was already changing. Sag Harbor had been deeply associated with whaling, but the decline of whaling did not erase the settlement or its waterfront. Transportation provided another channel through which people, goods, and money could move. Over time, visitors and seasonal residents became part of the local economy. The harbor remained physically useful, but its economic role was changing. That transition was gradual and practical. As whaling declined, Sag Harbor developed other waterfront industries, along with tourism and summer residence. The same streets and shoreline could support different kinds of activity because the economic network around them had changed. A whaling port could become a place visited for leisure. Buildings could shift uses. Land could be valued for proximity to transportation, water, and the growing seasonal economy. Nothing required a single dramatic morning when the old economy ended and the new one began. The evidence is more ordinary than that. One industry weakened. Other uses expanded. The settlement adjusted. Montauk followed its own version of that pattern later, and at a different scale. The railroad of 1895 connected the eastern end to a network that reached far beyond the local shoreline. The earlier experience of Sag Harbor shows why that connection mattered even when the largest proposed project failed. A transportation line can create opportunities that are smaller than the original promise and still permanently alter how a place is used. Tourism, seasonal residence, military movement, commerce, and land development can all depend on the same basic fact. People can get there. So the transformation of Long Island was not a clean replacement of one world by another. It was a chain of transitions. Whaling gave way in part to other waterfront industries. Railways extended access. Tourism expanded. Seasonal housing followed. Each stage left pieces of the previous one behind. The coastline remained, but the economic meaning attached to that coastline changed. If you look only for a single turning point, you miss the mechanism. The change came through repeated additions to the network, each one making another use of the land more practical. And at the edge of that changing network, Montauk Point Light continued its older work. The lighthouse did not compete with the railroad for passengers, land values, or seasonal visitors. Its function was simpler and more durable: guide vessels through the waters around Montauk Point. While rail lines altered access across the land, the light continued to mark the maritime route. The surrounding economy could change from whaling to tourism, from local transport to broader development, but the lighthouse remained tied to navigation. The route had changed. The ground stayed. The first clear marker came from the harbor itself. In 1871, the whaling ship left under the command of. It was one of the documented final departures of a local whaling economy that had once connected the village to a much larger maritime trade. The ship was still real, still moving, still carrying the habits of an older economy out toward the sea. But the departure had a different meaning now. A working port could remain visible after the system that made it important had begun to disappear. its own historical record places the end of its role as a whaling and maritime center in 1874. 3 years after sailed, the transition was effectively complete. The harbor did not vanish. The buildings did not vanish. The roads and waterfront remained. What changed was the economic work being performed around them. Other activities gradually took their place. That distinction matters, because places rarely become something else in a single dramatic moment. More often, an old economy loses one function, then another. While the physical town remains in place long enough to make the transition look almost ordinary. The decline of whaling on Eastern also had several pressures working at once. The supply of accessible whales was falling. The Civil War had disrupted trade and maritime activity. At the same time, petroleum was becoming increasingly important as a source of fuel. None of these changes required a single villain. Together, they altered the calculation behind an entire industry. A vessel, a harbor, a crew, and a route could all remain physically possible while becoming less useful economically. That is how an industry can disappear without the landscape disappearing with it. While the maritime economy contracted, another network was expanding across Eastern. Rail connections continued to link communities, and by the end of the 19th century the railway was carrying something increasingly important alongside freight and resources: people. Stations changed the practical meaning of distance. A place connected by rail could be reached by workers, visitors, merchants, and eventually residents whose relationship to the land was different from that of the earlier maritime economy. The railroad therefore became more than a replacement for one transport route. It widened the number of economic uses that could reach the same territory. Then the railroad itself stopped being the final answer. After the First World War, and especially during the second half of the 20th century, the automobile became another major mechanism shaping the economic geography of Eastern. As official history connects the post-war period with the strong influence of automobile transportation. The change was practical. Roads could distribute people beyond the fixed points of a railway station. A car could connect homes, workplaces, stores, beaches, and communities according to a much looser pattern. Access kept expanding, and every expansion changed who could use the land and what that land could support. That makes the story of the railroad more complicated than a simple tale of suburbanization. Transportation systems replaced and supplemented one another. Rail made certain distances practical. Cars made a different pattern of movement practical. Each system widened access for another group of users and another kind of economic activity. The important continuity was not the machine itself. It was access. The coastline, villages, roads, and parcels of land remained available while the network around them kept changing. The economy could reorganize itself because transportation repeatedly changed the cost and convenience of reaching the same ground. The lighthouse survived these transitions physically. Its stone, tower, lantern, and position on the coast remained tied to navigation. But the economic environment surrounding it became progressively less like the one that had existed when the lighthouse was built. The ships and industries using the region were changing. The communities connected to them were changing. Even the meaning of being close to the coast was changing as tourism, automobiles, and broader development became more important. The lighthouse did not participate in those changes as an economic actor. It simply remained there, carrying the same basic navigational duty through economies that no longer resembled one another. Then even the lighthouse's own working system changed. In 1987, the light was automated, ending the need for a permanent keeper. The building continued its function, but the human arrangement that had once maintained it was gone. For generations, the lighthouse had required a person to live there, watch the equipment, and keep the light operating. Automation removed that daily human presence while preserving the object's purpose. It was an unusually quiet ending to an entire chain of older arrangements. The harbor economy had changed. Transportation had changed, the land had changed, and finally the lighthouse no longer needed the keeper who had belonged to its older world. The lighthouse survived the end of the economy that built it. For most of its working life, the lighthouse had one problem to solve: how to remain visible to ships. Now the problem was becoming almost the opposite. The land beneath it was changing position. When the lighthouse was built, it stood roughly 300 feet back from the eastern edge of the bluff. That distance gave the structure a substantial margin between the tower and the Atlantic. But the margin was never permanent. Along this exposed section of Montauk Point, the shoreline gradually lost ground through erosion. Year after year, storm after storm, the distance narrowed. The lighthouse remained in place. The cliff did not. 300 feet became less than 50. That is a different kind of historical pressure. The industries around the lighthouse had already changed. Whaling had disappeared. Railroads had changed the movement of people and goods. Automobiles had altered access to the eastern end of Long Island. Tourism and development had given the surrounding land new economic uses. Through all of those changes, the lighthouse had remained physically useful. Erosion presented a simpler and more difficult question. There was no economic replacement for the ground beneath the tower. There was no new industry waiting to occupy the space. The object itself was now exposed to the physical condition of its coastline. You can see the difference in photographs. Older views leave a broad field of ground between the lighthouse and the edge. Modern views compress that space into a narrow strip. The tower appears almost unchanged, which makes the changing cliff easier to notice. The structure is still vertical. The shoreline is the part that has moved. Then came another reminder that the coast could become an engineering problem. Hurricane Sandy struck in 2012. The storm became one of the events, followed by additional federal funding for the protection of Montauk Point. The important point is not that one storm suddenly created the erosion problem. The shoreline had already been retreating for generations. Sandy became part of a longer record of coastal damage and the growing need to protect both infrastructure and historic resources at the point. By then, protecting Montauk Point required modern engineering on a scale that would have been almost unrecognizable to the people who first operated the lighthouse. In 2021, construction began on a new protective structure at Montauk Point. The broader restoration and protection project for the historic site was later valued at roughly $44 million. That number belongs to the present, and it tells its own story. A structure once built as working maritime infrastructure now sits inside a project involving federal protection, coastal engineering, historic preservation, and millions of dollars in public investment. The lighthouse did not become less important because the old economy disappeared. Its importance changed categories. But the distinction matters. Erosion did not cause Long Island to move from whaling toward real estate. Those were separate historical processes. The decline of whaling followed changes in resources, trade, technology, and fuel. The growth of property and tourism followed changes in transportation, accessibility, investment, and demand. The erosion threatening the lighthouse belongs to another timeline. It is a present physical threat to an object that has already survived several economic timelines. And the lighthouse itself had already entered a new institutional life. In 1996, the United States Coast Guard transferred ownership of the lighthouse to the Montauk Historical Society. The transfer formalized a change that had been developing for years. The tower was no longer simply a piece of maritime infrastructure maintained within the operating system of navigation. It had become a historic property whose preservation was part of its continuing purpose. Then, on March 5, 2012, Montauk Point Light received designation as a National Historic Landmark. That came more than 2 centuries after the beginning of its operation. The designation placed the lighthouse within a different national framework: preservation, interpretation, and protection of a surviving historic resource. There is an irony in that transformation. The lighthouse was built to serve a working coastline. It was meant to function, not to become a relic. Yet after the economic world around it changed, preservation became part of what kept it alive. And after the land beneath it began to retreat, physical protection became necessary as well. The old market had already moved on. The lighthouse remained. Now the shoreline itself was becoming the problem. The lighthouse outlived the market. Then the shoreline itself came for it. Today, Montauk Point Light stands at the eastern end of Long Island, within a state park where the old working coastline has become a place of recreation as well as navigation. People come to fish along the shore. Visitors come to walk the grounds, see the tower, and look out over the water. The lighthouse itself still performs the basic job for which it was built. It remains an active navigational aid. The setting around it is different, but the light still marks the same dangerous edge of land and sea. That creates a strange continuity. A visitor can stand near the tower and watch fishermen working from the rocks while other people arrive simply to see the historic site. The same coastline now supports recreation, tourism, preservation, and navigation at once. The lighthouse sits inside that mixture without changing its essential function. It does not need to become something else to survive. The meaning attached to the place has expanded around it. The operating system inside the lighthouse has changed, though. In 1987, the light was automated. The permanent keeper disappeared from the daily life of the building. Then, in 1996, the United States Coast Guard transferred ownership to the Montauk Historical Society. Those two changes came from different directions, but together they created a new model. The lighthouse could continue functioning as navigation infrastructure while being managed and preserved as a historic property. For much of its earlier life, maintenance was part of the physical existence of the station. A keeper lived with the equipment. The light required attention. The building belonged to an active maritime system in a very literal sense. Automation separated the operation of the light from the presence of a resident keeper. The later transfer of ownership separated the property from the government system that had operated it. The tower remained. The institution around it changed. In 2012, that new identity became even more formal. Montauk Point Light received designation as a National Historic Landmark. By the 2020s, the surrounding historic property was also part of continuing shoreline protection and restoration work. The project at Montauk Point involved modern coastal engineering alongside preservation of an old maritime structure. A lighthouse that had once been protected mainly because ships needed it now required protection because the building itself had become historically important. The contrast is visible in the ground around the tower. Modern construction, shoreline protection, visitors, and preservation work all occupy the same landscape that once served a much narrower maritime purpose. The lighthouse has crossed into a different institutional category without becoming useless. It still sends its signal. It still stands at the point. But now the historical value of the structure is part of the reason resources are committed to keeping it there. Long Island itself is harder to describe with a single economic label. Its eastern end contains permanent communities, tourism, transportation networks, valuable real estate, working waterfronts, and preserved pieces of an older maritime landscape. The roads that carry visitors today belong to a different transportation system from the rail lines that transformed access in the 19th century. Houses and seasonal properties occupy land whose earlier economic uses were often tied to fishing, farming, shipping, or whaling. That does not mean the old coastline disappeared. Some of its physical traces remain precisely because later uses did not erase everything that came before. The harbor, the roads, the buildings, the shoreline, and the lighthouse can all carry several periods of history at once. What changed was the economic weight attached to each one. A working waterfront can become a tourist destination. A transport corridor can become part of a commuter network. A maritime structure can become a historic attraction while still performing its original technical function. Sag Harbor offers another version of the same process. Its whaling and manufacturing economy declined, and the local economy developed around other activities, including tourism, trade, and summer residence. The harbor remained physically present while the reasons for using it changed. The transition was not a clean replacement from one morning to the next. Different economic uses accumulated over time, until the older maritime economy no longer explained the town by itself. Montauk followed a related pattern, but its lighthouse makes the transformation unusually easy to see. The tower survived while the land around it acquired new uses. People now visit the point partly because the lighthouse is there. Its historical story has become one of the reasons the location attracts visitors, alongside the coast itself, fishing, and the broader landscape. The building that once existed to help people safely pass the point has become part of why people deliberately travel to the point. That is the reversal at the center of the story. The lighthouse was built for ships. Now people come to look at the lighthouse. And yet the original function has not disappeared. The first construction began in 1796, when the lighthouse was built at Montauk Point to serve vessels navigating the coast. The light began operating the following year. More than 2 centuries later, the tower still occupies that same edge of Long Island. Its role has accumulated layers, but the physical object has remained remarkably direct: a tower, a light, a position on the coast, and a continuing navigational purpose. The historical object and the working object are now the same thing. Today, Montauk Point Light stands. Its light continues to operate as a navigational aid. Its grounds are preserved, its history is interpreted, and the structure remains protected as a National Historic Landmark. You can still look at the tower and see the working infrastructure of the 18th century. You can also see the result of 2 centuries of economic change around it. Same lighthouse. Different Long Island.